The dragon variation of the Sicilian defense is the sharpest and most puzzling of all openings. Anyone of any strength can defeat a stronger opponent with it. In this tape I shall analyze some of the major variations. Of course, everything cannot be covered. I shall cover what I consider the best variations from the black point of view. After playing through this tape 2 or 3 times and reading the accompanying pamphlet, one is ready to use the opening in practice. I will also quote other sources which may be helpful. Now on to the Sicilian dragon. The preparatory moves which give the dragon its names are as follows. White plays 1 pawn to king 4. Black replies pawn to queen's bishop 4. White replies knight to king's bishop 3. Black plays pawn to queen's 3. White plays pawn to queen 4. Black plays pawn takes pawn. White plays knight takes pawn. Black plays knight to king's bishop 3. White replies knight to queen's bishop 3. Black plays pawn to king knight 3, fianchettoing his bishop. This is the only correct move order. All other move orders give white other options. Now we have come to the first bridge. What will white play? The first move to be analyzed is 6 bishop to king 3. Make this move on your board and look at the position and consider white's possibilities. White will obviously try to trade off black's fianchettoed bishop, thus weakening black squares around his king. This means that white will try for a king-side attack. Black will counter on the queen side and try to control the key queen-bishop 4 square. Now we go on to black's reply to white's 6th move, bishop to king 3. Black replies bishop to knight 2, the only logical reply. White's 7th move is pawn to king bishop 3. This is the dreaded Yugoslav attack. This is a potent weapon for white, but if it is handled correctly by black, he should be very comfortable. Black replies 7 knight to bishop 3. White plays 8 queen to queen 2. Black castles. White now intends to remove black's fianchettoed bishop by playing an eventual bishop to rook 6. He cannot do this immediately because of the reply, bishop takes bishop, queen takes bishop, knight takes knight, winning a piece. White plays 9 bishop to queen bishop 4. This is the move that is in fashion at present. The alternative, which we shall consider first, is 9 castles queenside. Now black should continue 9 pawn to queen 4. This is a pawn sacrifice which was introduced by Alexander Konstantinov in 1937 and is quite good for black. He is able to get his heavy pieces to the queen's wing for an attack. If white now plays knight takes knight, black plays pawn takes knight, recapturing the piece. White now plays 11, bishop to king rook 6. Turn off your tape recorder after making this move and analyze the position carefully. You should take a minimum of 5 minutes. I hope you have found that if black replies, bishop takes bishop, queen takes bishop, pawn to king 4, white would now reply queen to king knight 5, exclamation point, with a completely superior position. Now, if you bring your position back to diagram 2, which is after white plays 11 bishop to king rook 6, we will start analyzing after black's 11th move. Black plays 11 bishop to king 3, exclamation point. Play could now continue pawn to king 5 for white, knight to queen 2 for black. White's center is now been weakened considerably. White plays bishop takes bishop to relieve some of the central tension. Black now is forced to retake the bishop with his king. If you now turn your tape recorder off once again and then analyze the position, it is important to notice how black will defend his king side. Turn off your tape recorder and look at these possibilities. White plays pawn to king's rook 4, starting a lethal attack on the black king. Black now defends with pawn to king rook 4, exclamation point. White plays pawn to king knight 4. Black now plays rook to king rook 1, double exclamation point. The position is now considered equal, but I consider black quite better. White has no advantageous way of continuing his kingside progress. For instance, if pawn to knight 5, black may play rook to queen knight 1, following this with queen to queen knight 3, with a mating attack on the white king. As can be seen, white's only pawn break is pawn to king bishop 5, which cannot be enforced. Thus, the position is superior, in my opinion, to black. Now, go back to the position in diagram 3 after black's 9th move, pawn to queen 4. After black plays 9 pawn to queen 4, initiating the pawn sacrifice, white may accept it by pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn. White's knight on queen 4 takes black's knight on queen bishop 3. Black replies the obvious, pawn takes knight. White now plays knight takes knight. Black plays pawn takes knight. White plays queen takes pawn. Now turn off your tape recorder and find black's reply. There is only one correct reply, otherwise black is lost. Black now plays queen to bishop 2! Exclamation point! Don't worry, the rook is not emprise totally. White plays queen takes rook. Uh-oh, black is now down a rook. What shall he play? Bishop to king bishop 4! Exclamation point! He is now simultaneously threatening checkmate on queen bishop 2 and the white queen with black's king rook. White plays queen takes rook, check. Black replies king takes queen, thus keeping his bishop on the important diagonal against the white king. White now plays rook to queen 2, protecting against mate. Black plays pawn to king rook 4! Exclamation point! The point behind this move is that, firstly, it stops the white pawn rush on king knight 4, thus keeping black's bishop on the important diagonal, and eventually pawn to rook 5 will stymie the white pawn mass. White now plays bishop to king 2. Black plays, queen to knight 1, threatening the knight pawn. White plays pawn to queen knight 3. Now retract this move on your board and let white play pawn to queen's bishop 3. Now turn off your tape recorder and find black's lethal retort. I hope you have found bishop takes bishop pawn, pawn takes bishop, queen to knight 8 checkmate. If you have not, turn off your tape recorder and look again. White now plays pawn to queen knight 3, as I said before. Black now makes a strong counter, bishop to queen bishop 6! Exclamation point, attacking the white rook. White now moves his rook to queen 5. Black now attacks the rook again with bishop to king 3. White plays rook to queen knight 5. Black plays queen to queen 3. This position is considered better for black due to his active queen. An example of this is the game Stolyer-Bielin, Leningrad, 1955. Now set up the position on your board after diagram 4. This is after black's 19th move. White now replies rook to queen 3. Black plays queen to queen knight 5, threatening penetration on rook 6. White now plays king to knight 1. Black now obviously cannot play queen or rook 6 because of the reply rook takes bishop. So black decides to drive the bishop away with bishop to king bishop 4, threatening the white rook. White plays rook to queen 8 check. Black's only move is king to king knight 2. This simultaneously gets the king out of check and lets the black king penetrate to bishop 3, knight 4, rook 5 for an eventual endgame advantage, should white play pawn to king rook 3. In the game, white now played king's rook to queen 1, doubling up on the file. Black played bishop to king's bishop 3, threatening penetration on bishop 6. White played bishop to queen 3. Stop. Black now replied queen to queen bishop 6, threatening mate on knight 7. White played king to bishop 1. Black played pawn to king 4, threatening the white rook on queen 8. If white now proceeds with rook to queen rook 8, removing his rook from the attack of the bishop, black would proceed pawn to king 5. If white now plays pawn takes pawn, black plays bishop to king knight 5, threatening the white rook. If the rook now moves to any square, black has queen to rook 8 check, followed by bishop to bishop 6, mate. If white, instead of playing pawn takes pawn, plays bishop takes pawn, black would play queen takes bishop check, winning a piece. Now let's return to diagram 5. In this position, white plays 14, queen to queen bishop 5, declining the pawn sacrifice. Black now replies queen to queen knight 1. Now turn your tapes off and find white's reply. White plays pawn to queen knight 3. This is the best move. In most theoretical works, it was considered to give white an advantage. The Russians found pawn to queen rook 4, exclamation point, freeing the black queen side. White now plays queen to knight 6. Black plays queen to king 4, with threats on the queen side. White plays bishop to queen 4, exclamation point. Black plays queen to bishop 5, check. White plays bishop to king 3. Black replies queen to king 4, with a draw by repetition. If instead white had played 18, king to knight 1, instead of bishop to king 3, turn off your tape recorder and find how black wins. If white played king to knight 1, black would reply rook to queen knight 1 on the white queen. Now, obviously, if white takes off the queen rook pawn, he loses his bishop on queen 4. And if white plays queen to rook 7, bishop to bishop 4 would be strong. So white plays bishop to king 3 on the black queen. Now if rook takes queen, bishop takes queen, and white is winning. Black plays queen to king 4, exclamation point. If white now plays bishop to queen 4, rook takes queen, wins a piece. If white plays the tricky queen to queen 4, black plays queen takes queen, exclamation point. If white plays bishop takes queen, it would appear that he's simply up a pawn. But black has the retort, rook to queen 1, at which point white is losing a piece. The reason for this is pawn to bishop 3, pawn to king 4. The bishop is pinned to the white rook on queen 1, and black will simply take off the bishop with a winning material advantage. Another interesting line for white is as follows. 1. Pawn to king 4. Pawn to queen bishop 4. Knight to king's bishop 3. Pawn to queen 3. Pawn to queen 4. Pawn takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Knight to king bishop 3. Knight to queen bishop 3. Pawn to king knight 3. The familiar dragon position of diagram 1. This may seem repetitious for you, the fact that I'm going through the moves, but it is the only way for you to acquaint yourself with the position. It takes a great deal of time. White now plays bishop to king 3, bishop to knight 2, pawn to bishop 3, knight to bishop 3, queen to queen 2, castles. 9 castles queenside, pawn to queen 4. You should be very familiar with this sacrifice by now, and I hope you are happy with it. White plays pawn takes pawn. Black plays knight takes pawn. White plays knight from queen 4 takes knight on bishop 3. Black plays pawn takes knight. Now white plays the important move bishop to queen 4. Black now must play pawn to king 4, retaining the dragon bishop. Now if white plays bishop to bishop 5, black may play one of two moves. Bishop to king 3, which was formerly considered to equalize and still does, or the less known rook to king 1. This has not been considered good up until recently. White now may play knight takes knight, pawn takes knight, queen takes pawn, the only move because of black's massive pawn center, but quite good. Black will now reply queen takes queen, exclamation point, rook takes queen, bishop to king 3. If white now plays rook to queen 1, then king rook to bishop 1, with overwhelming counterplay. You can notice he is both on the white bishop and the black queen rook pawn. This counterplay is quite good, and in my opinion, better for black. Instead of rook to queen 1, white may try rook to queen 3. In this case, king rook to bishop 1, followed by bishop takes rook pawn, is also quite good. You now should be fully acquainted with all the methods after white plays 9 castle queenside, and you reply with Konstantinov's pawn sacrifice. I believe after pawn to queen 4, you should be never in any danger of losing. Just take time with your moves and analyze out all the tactics. You must remember that tactics are the key to the dragon, and due to these tactics, a weaker player can always beat a stronger player, because tactics are mechanical and motives are not involved. Now let's return to the main analysis. Please set up the diagram after 2a. This follows white's 9 bishop to queen bishop 4. Black plays bishop to queen 2. This frees the queen bishop 8 square for black's rook and also develops the bishop to its best square. White replies, 10, castle's queenside. This brings White's king to a potentially safe square. Notice I say potentially because I intend to mate him there. And frees White's queen rook for an attack on the king's side. Black plays queen rook to bishop 1. It is known that black has 3 moves in this position. They are 1, queen to queen knight 1, question mark. Although in England this move is considered quite good, it has been refuted in the United States, so I would not recommend it. He also may play queen to queen's rook 4, where there is too much analysis to go through, and probably it is not as good as rook to queen bishop 1. I myself play rook to queen bishop 1 and have a great deal of success with it, and Tarjan has become a grandmaster using it. So let's continue from there. Black has now played 10, queen rook to bishop 1, threatening knight takes knight, and then he's on White's king's bishop. White replies, 11, bishop to queen knight 3. Black now plays knight to king 4. I feel that this is the road to equality. Jonathan Mestel, one of England's top juniors, has played pawn to queen rook 4 with tremendous success. This move I do not feel is correct, and in fact has been refuted in the United States. White's 12th move is pawn to king rook 4. Black plays knight to bishop 5, removing one of White's bishops. There is a large bridge to cross now. There are 2 main moves. 1, queen to queen 3, we will look at first. White plays queen to queen 3. Black removes White's black squared bishop. Knight takes bishop. White plays queen takes knight. Black plays queen to queen knight 3, with the big threat of pawn to king 4, netting a piece. White plays queen to queen 2. Black plays queen to queen bishop 4, exclamation point. White's attack now lacks any punch, due to the fact that he's missing his black squared bishop and has no mate threats while Black's bishop is around. His attack in the center is basically meaningless, and he is devoid of play. Now let's return to the position after Black plays 12, knight to bishop 5. This is diagram 6 in your pamphlet. You should become quite familiar with this position, as it is the key position to the dragon. White plays bishop takes knight, the best move. Black replies, rook takes bishop. White now plays pawn to rook 5. Black plays knight takes rook pawn. All gifts are accepted in New York, Grecian or otherwise. White plays pawn to king knight 4, and black moves his knight back to bishop 3. White plays bishop to rook 6. This is a key move, although it's not that good. It must be noted, otherwise you might find yourself in difficulties. Now switch off the tape and try to find Black's saving rejoinder. It would appear as though he is crushed. Look and see. Take at least 15 minutes for this move. It took Korchnoi an hour. Did you find it? If not, don't be upset because it's quite a difficult move to find. Black plays knight takes king pawn exclamation point, or as they say in New York, jazz mark. White plays pawn takes knight. Black plays rook takes knight. White plays queen to rook 2. After queen to rook 2, black is simply better since his king is escaping on king bishop 3. This is quite an interesting position, and it would take a great deal of time to analyze on the tape, so I believe you should just refer to the pamphlet for the... Now let's return to the position after black played 16, knight takes king pawn, which is diagram number 7 in your pamphlet. The crucial line is 17, queen to king 3 for white, and black plays rook takes knight on bishop 3. White retorts pawn takes rook, and black plays knight to king bishop 3. Let me say that you must always be prepared to give up an exchange in the dragon. You may say that if white transposes into an ending, you may feel that you're lost. But in the dragon, you must remember that white has already given up one pawn on the king-rook file, and his king-bishop pawn is weak, his queen-bishop pawns are doubled and weak, and his queen-rook pawn is isolated. These facts will give you an equal ending. Plus, you have the 2 bishops. White now plays, following 18 knight to bishop 3 for black, bishop takes bishop, king takes bishop. White's 20th move is rook to rook 2, exclamation point. Rook to king 1 for black is best, as analyzed by international master Bernard Zuckerman. It protects black's king pawn and prepares queen to queen rook 4 with good play. This is quite fine for black. Instead of 20 rook to rook 2, white might try queen to rook 6 check, as played by Geller against Korchnoi. Black now must play king to rook 1, exclamation point. White now can play pawn to knight 5. Black would play knight to king rook 4. Rook takes knight. Pawn takes rook. Queen takes pawn. Rook to knight 1, as is at least equal. Another try for white, following queen to rook 6, king to rook 1, is rook to rook 2. I think you should replace black's pawn on king knight 3, his knight on king's bishop 3, his rook on king bishop 1, and white's king knight pawn on knight 4, and the white queen on rook 6. You should now have the correct position. White proceeded in brown Tatey, rook to rook 2, and black replied rook to king knight 1. White now played queen to knight 5. Note that if white had played pawn to knight 5, knight to rook 4 transposes. This is the point behind rook to king knight 1. Black now played queen to bishop 2, threatening white's queen bishop pawn. White played king to knight 2. Tatey now proceeded bishop to king 3, exclamation point. Brown played knight takes bishop. Black played pawn takes knight. And following the game, they analyzed it and considered black was slightly better. Now, replace the pieces as in diagram 7. I'll give you a few seconds to do that. White knight takes knight. Black rook takes knight. Queen to rook 2 with threats. Black plays bishop to king 4, exclamation point. Queen to rook 4, rook takes knight, exclamation point. Pawn takes rook, queen to knight 3, exclamation point. You should note that if instead of pawn takes rook, bishop takes rook, black has a rejoinder queen to queen knight 3. Now, if queen takes pawn check, king takes bishop, pawn takes rook, white is now up 2 exchanges, but black has queen takes pawn check, king to queen 2, bishop to bishop 6 check, king to king 2, bishop takes knight pawn check, king to bishop 2, queen takes bishop pawn check, king to knight 1, queen takes rook check, king to rook 2, bishop to king 4 check. White's king now proceeds to knight 2, and black plays bishop to bishop 6 check, winning. Now if you would return to diagram 8, which is after black plays rook takes knight on white's king 4, white will play pawn takes rook, queen to knight 3, pawn to bishop 3, rook to bishop 1, with an overwhelming game for black. Now if you would please return to diagram 8 and replace black's rook on white's queen 4 square and white's queen on his king rook 2 square, and instead of queen to rook 4, play pawn to bishop 4, attacking black's bishop. This move, pawn to king bishop 4, was considered a refutation of this whole rook to bishop 1 line. But black has recently, and when I say recently, in the last 10 years, found that rook takes rook check, rook takes rook. Now if king takes rook, obviously bishop takes knight pawn check is quite good. So he plays rook takes rook, bishop to king rook 1, exclamation point. Bishop takes rook. Now turn off your tape and try to find black's move. Black plays queen to knight 3, double exclamation point. White plays pawn to bishop 3, and black plays the important move, queen to king 6 check. White plays knight to queen 2. Black plays king takes bishop. White plays queen takes king rook pawn. Again, turn off your tape and find black's move. I hope you found bishop takes bishop pawn. Pawn takes bishop, queen takes pawn check. King to knight 1, bishop takes knight pawn, winning. After this analysis, it can be said that if white continues in this way, black is quite fine. Now return to diagram 7 and replace white's bishop on king 3 and black's knight on king bishop 3. If white now continues 16 queen rook to king knight 1, black simply replies rook to king knight 1. Rook to king 1, excuse me. If white now plays knight from 3 to king 2, black plays pawn to king 4, knight to knight 3, bishop to king 3, knight to knight 3, pawn to queen 4 with advantage. Again, return to the position that you just had before white played queen rook 2, king knight 1, and play the complicated pawn to king 5. Black's best move now is knight takes king knight pawn, a necessary and good piece sack to prevent a disaster on the queen file. You should note that white's rook and queen are doubled up, and black's queen is only protected once by the rook, and the bishop only once by the queen. So if pawn takes pawn, knight to knight 5, pawn takes pawn, knight to knight 3, pawn to knight 5 will present a tragedy. So black plays knight takes knight pawn. Pawn takes knight, bishop takes knight pawn on the rook. Queen rook to knight 1. Pawn takes pawn. If rook takes bishop, pawn takes knight is quite good. But white does play rook takes bishop. Pawn takes knight is quite good for equality, but if black wants to play for more, he has the excellent move, pawn to king rook 4, exclamation point. This was considered a winning advantage for black, up until recently, when they found rook takes king rook pawn, exclamation point. Now turn off your tape and find black's move. Black plays rook takes knight, exclamation point. Bishop takes rook, pawn takes bishop, knight to king 4. Black now plays pawn takes rook. Black is now up 3 pawns. See if you can find white's next move. I hope you found rook takes bishop check. King takes rook. Queen to knight 5 check with a perpetual check. Again, return to the position before white played pawn to king 5, which is diagram 7, minus bishop to rook 6, and knight takes king pawn. White will now continue knight from 4 to king 2. This is a line that Karpov smashed Korchnoi with. It is only that strong if black provides help. Korchnoi played queen to rook 4, which will be analyzed in the game section of this tape, but rook to king 1 is a large improvement by the American grandmaster Tarjan. Play can continue. 17, pawn to king 5, exclamation point. Knight takes pawn. Pawn takes knight. Bishop takes knight pawn. This is diagram 9. If white now continues, pawn takes pawn. Black plays queen takes pawn. Queen takes queen is the correct move. In the game, Martin, Tarjan, queen to king 1 was played. Tarjan continued, queen to rook 3, exclamation point. Martin played rook to queen 3. Tarzan played pawn to queen knight 4, threatening pawn to knight 5, knight moves, queen takes rook pawn winning. Martin played king to knight 1. Tarzan played bishop to bishop 4, exclamation point, and won a few moves later. Okay. If you would return to diagram number 9 and put black's bishop on queen 2, white's pawns on king knight 4, and king bishop 3, and black's pawn on queen 3, and white's pawn on king 4, and black's knight on bishop 3, and play bishop to rook 6, we would have the key theoretical position which this line of the dragon depends upon. Black now plays bishop to rook 1, and white plays pawn to king 5. This is the crucial difference. With white's bishop on rook 6, after the exchange of pawns on the queen file following the piece sacrifice, black's bishop is not en prise on king 3. White's bishop is not en prise on king 3. These mistakes happen. Now, white proceeds pawn to king 5 on the 18th move. Knight takes knight pawn. Pawn takes knight. Bishop takes knight pawn. Pawn takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Now we have the same position we had in the other variation with the exchange of moves bishop to rook 6 and bishop to rook 1, which keeps white's position together, maybe. White now plays queen takes queen, only move, pawn takes queen, rook takes pawn. White is now up a full piece for 3 connected passed pawns, but black only has 2 pawns for the piece. Black now plays bishop to knight 2, exclamation point. Bishop takes bishop. Any bishop retreat loses a knight on king 2. King takes bishop. And now we come to the big bridge. For knight to knight 3, as in Planet Tarzan, see illustrative game at the end of this tape. Knight to queen 4 was played in brown Tarzan, which ended up in a draw. Alright. After knight to queen 4, black proceeded pawn to king rook 4, and brown played king to queen 2. Black now played rook from 5 to queen bishop 1. He exchanged rooks on the queen file and advanced the kingside pawns to get a draw. An attempted improvement was played in the game Shamkovich-Fedorowicz, where white played knight to queen 1 instead of king to queen 2. If you cannot remember this position, refer to diagram 10. The moves then that would reach this position are pawn to king rook 4 for black and knight to queen 1 for white. The same method was used by Fedorowicz, rook to bishop 1, and rook to queen 1. Fedorowicz blundered at a crucial point and lost, but his position was clearly superior. Play might continue. Rook from 5 to bishop 1, king to queen 2. Rook from king 1 to queen 1, rook takes rook, rook takes rook, pawn to bishop 3. Play then can continue, king to rook 3, knight to bishop 2, bishop to bishop 1, exclamation point. king to king 3, rook to knight 1, with a good game for black. If you handle the Yugoslav attack like Jim Tarjan, you'll get your Grandmaster title next Olympiad. We're now done with the positions arising out of the Yugoslav attack. I don't think you should have any problem with this if you play it correctly. The important thing is to play the proper move orders, keep your cool, and watch out for all tactics. We now leave the survey on the Yugoslav attack and continue to the classical dragon. I would say that the classical dragon should be nothing for you to worry about. It's quite passive and positional, but black has equal play. The moves are as follows. 1, pawn to king 4, pawn to queen bishop 4, knight to king bishop 3, pawn to queen 3, pawn to queen 4, pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn, knight to king bishop 3, knight to queen bishop 3, pawn to king knight 3, bishop to king 2, bishop to knight 2, bishop to king 3, knight to bishop 3. Castles, black castles. White plays knight to knight 3. Black's best move at this point is bishop to king 3, exclamation point. White now has pawn to king bishop 4. Queen to bishop 1. This is an old idea of Tartakower's and is quite good. I use it all the time. White now has quite a few moves. I shall go into what I consider the important variants. 11, king to rook 1. Rook to queen 1. Aiming for pawn to queen 4 is the main freeing method in the dragon. White plays bishop to bishop 3, stopping pawn to queen 4. Black plays bishop to bishop 5, attacking white's rook. White plays rook to king 1, exclamation point. The rook is misplaced in this variation on bishop 2. Black plays pawn to king 4, exclamation point. Queen to queen 2, queen to bishop 2, with equal play. Go back to diagram 11, which is after black's move queen to bishop 1, and play pawn to king rook 3 for white. The reason behind this move is to stop knight to king knight 5 at some point for black, disturbing the white bishop. We shall now follow the game Dr. Aitken of Scotland versus Eric Moskow of the United States in the Jersey International Chess Congress. Black played pawn queen rook 4, exclamation point. Although it is not given an exclamation point in most opening surveys, they consider knight to queen 4 now a good move for white. Aitken replied pawn to queen rook 4. Black played knight to queen knight 5, aiming for pawn to queen 4. Aitken replied bishop to king bishop 3. Black now played knight to queen 2. Aitken replied knight to queen 4. Had Aitken played bishop to queen 4, turn off your tape recorder and find black's winning move. I wonder if you found knight takes queen bishop pawn, with the possible variations queen takes knight, bishop takes knight, queen takes bishop, bishop takes bishop check, winning. If Knight takes bishop pawn, bishop takes bishop, bishop takes knight, bishop takes rook, knight takes rook, tempoing on the queen because the knight that just took the rook protects the bishop, which attacks the queen. Queen takes knight, queen takes bishop on king bishop 1, and black is up a clear pawn for nothing. So Aiken played knight to queen 4. I replied bishop to bishop 5. Aiken replied bishop to king 2. The move rook to bishop 2 instead of bishop to king 2 is better, as played in Bronstein-Korchnoi from the Soviet Championship of a few years ago. I now replied bishop takes bishop. Aiken took with the queen. Now I played a brilliant shot. Turn off your tape recorder and find it. I played knight to knight 3. This move took me 45 minutes to find and is quite involved. As you can see, the knight, if allowed to go into queen bishop 5, is an immediate winner because you're on both the bishop and the knight pawn, and the knight with the bishop. So Aiken played knight to bishop 5, got up from the table with a smile, and said to one of his contemporaries, "I've beaten the young master." I replied, pawn takes knight, bishop takes knight, and calmly played my queen to queen bishop 3. Aiken now looked at the board, looked at me, and said, "I've been fooled." He then played his bishop back to king bishop 2. I replied, pawn takes pawn. He played knight takes pawn. He cannot allow the maneuver pawn to king bishop 4, followed by pawn to queen 4 with the central pawn roller. I play queen takes pawn, attacking the queen and the knight simultaneously. Queen takes queen, knight takes queen on his rook, queen rook to bishop 1. Now if my knight moves, he penetrates to the 7th with an equal game. I play king rook to bishop 1. He now plays knight to queen bishop 5. If rook takes knight, bishop takes rook is equal. I play knight to queen 5, and my opponent resigns. This should show you the possibilities against this particular variation. I believe if you play with the motive of controlling queen bishop 5, playing a timely pawn to king 4 if necessary after your bishop attacks his rook on bishop 5, and try to get in queen 4 by playing pawn to queen rook 4, pawn to queen rook 4, knight to queen knight 5, should have no trouble meeting this type of line and should score many points from it. Another possibility, which white has been using in the recent days, is the Levenfish attack. This encompasses the move order: pawn to king 4, pawn to queen bishop 4, knight to king bishop 3, pawn to queen 3, pawn to queen 4, pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn, knight to king bishop 3, knight to queen bishop 3, pawn to king knight 3, pawn to bishop 4. This opening is the trademark of the Russian former grandmaster Grigory Levenfish. I believe black's next best move is queen knight to queen 2. I myself play knight to bishop 3, but this is highly complex and would take pages and pages of analysis. When you find yourself have reached the stage where you feel you can go on to this, the book The Sicilian Dragon by David Levy gives quite good analysis in it, and the pamphlet to come out by Chess Digest by Bernard Zuckerman with editing by Eric Moskow is also quite good. Now, queen knight to queen 2, bishop to king 2, bishop to knight 2. May I say at this point that if black had played bishop to knight 2 instead of queen knight to queen 2, a couple of moves back, pawn to king 5 is a strong reply, although Mestel has played it and won quite a few games. I don't think this either is suitable to the style of the player rated under 190 because the complications are tremendous. This is safe, solid, and sound. Black will now be faced with the move by white of 8, bishop to king 3. Black castles. White plays bishop to bishop 3, and black plays knight to knight 3. White plays knight to knight 3, and black plays bishop to king 3. Black will now occupy the queen bishop 4 square with what I believe is an equal game. Do not be fooled when you look this variation up in a book and they say white is better. Black is certainly equal. If you would return to diagram number 12, which is after the move pawn to bishop 4, you'll find that white can also play this following moves. Pawn to bishop 4, queen knight to queen 2, bishop to king 2, bishop to knight 2. Now, instead of bishop to king 3, he may castle. Black will now castle. If he plays bishop to king 3 now, it will transpose to the other variation. Instead, king to rook 1, pawn to queen rook 3, bishop to bishop 3, pawn to king 4 exclamation point. May I note that black would like to play pawn to queen knight 4, but it was impossible because white would have replied pawn to king 5, attacking the rook on rook 1 with his bishop. White will now play knight from 4 to king 2. Pawn takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Pawn to king knight 4, exclamation point. Pawn to king 5, exclamation point. Knight to king 1, queen to queen 3, queen to king 2, knight to queen 5, queen to bishop 4, queen to bishop 5, knight to knight 3, and black is much better and almost winning in Ely Whitley, England 73. This ends our survey on the dragon variation of the Sicilian. I hope you've enjoyed it. Now let me give 2 illustrative games from recent tournament practice that show the possibilities for both sides.
Since Eric had to go off to the US, he didn't have time to analyze the illustrative game Karpov-Korchnoi from the World Championship match. That's why I, Michael Basman, am doing it for him. So please have the position of diagram K1 set up on your board. It was at this point that Karpov played the new move knight on queen 4 to king 2. To reinforce the queen's bishop 3 square, and if necessary, transfer the knight to the king side via kb4, or even to get to queen 5 that way. Korchnoi replied with the natural queen to rook 4, which Eric says was an error, and recommends Tarjan's move rook to king 1 instead. After black's queen to rook 4, white brought his bishop to king's rook 6. Black exchanged, bishop takes bishop, and white played queen takes bishop. Now black played rook on bishop 1 to queen's bishop 1. Please switch off here and consider the position. The key to this position is the black knight on king's bishop 3. If it were not there, white would mate in 2. So why not try to dislodge it with white knight to queen 5? Black might go rook takes pawn check here. White king to knight 1. And then black looks around for a good move. In fact, white's threats are not that dangerous. He isn't threatening knight takes knight check, because when black recaptures with the king pawn, there's a bolt hole for the king on king 2. So black could simply ignore white's threats and go queen to knight 4, threatening mate himself, as well as the knight on king 2. If you're reasonably satisfied with this analysis, please return to diagram K2. Another method of dislodging the knight is pawn to knight 5. The knight goes to rook 4, and now comes the point of Karpov's knight to king 2. He plays knight to bishop 4 here. Now I should make the general point that the move doesn't actually mate, because black can play queen to king 4 here and return his pawn. After white knight takes knight, black pawn takes knight, white queen takes the rook pawn on rook 5, black queen back to knight 2, guards the rook pawn, and now white could probably go something like pawn to bishop 4. The position looks a bit dubious for black because white's going to come forward, pawn to bishop 5, things like that. So we'll have to go back again to diagram K2. Add the moves pawn to knight 5 for white, and then black knight to rook 4. And white plays knight to bishop 4. In fact, in this position, black needn't bother about being mated. He can immediately counter-sacrifice with rook takes knight, which I think gives him at least a draw. In view of this, white prepared his pawn push, pawn to knight 5, from the diagram K2. Have you got the position? White knight on king 2, black knight back to KB3, white pawn back onto knight 4. So white prepared his pawn push with rook to queen 3. A rather awkward looking move, but it does diminish the force of any black sacrifice on queen's bishop 3 by rook takes knight. So white's pawn to knight 5 is a real threat after all. If there are any improvements to be found in Karpov-Korchnoi, I think they'll reside in this position. Therefore I suggest you switch off and try to save Korchnoi's game and the World Championship as well. Difficult, wasn't it? I find the suggestion black queen to queen 1 to transfer it to KB1 rather unconvincing after white goes just knight to bishop 4. The move that Korchnoi chose, that replaced the black queen on rook 4 and white's knight on king 2, was black rook on bishop 5 to bishop 4. And that's aimed against white's threatened pawn to knight 5. So switch off again and analyze the position from white's point of view. White's actual move was to play pawn to knight 5 anyway. Black captured, rook takes pawn, and now you can take white's side again and try to find his move. White has to justify his sacrifice of a second pawn, so he played the very artistic rook to queen 5. I think if he'd played knight to queen 5, black could just have played rook takes knight. But after rook to queen 5, black must play now rook takes rook. And now white's knight came in with a gain of tempo. Knight takes rook. This time black hasn't got any counterplay on the queen's bishop file, and he's faced by knight takes king's pawn check, so he moved his rook to king 1. Now how should white continue? Switch off here. White brought the other knight in with knight on king 2 to bishop 4. This threatens to block black's king's escape to king 2 by playing knight takes knight check and then knight to queen 5. So that's why black chose to cover queen 5 with his bishop. He could have put his bishop on queen's bishop 3 or king 3. And which do you think is the better? Now let's see, if he'd gone bishop to king 3, white plays knight takes bishop, black pawn takes knight, white knight takes knight check, black pawn takes knight, white queen takes rooks, pawn check, black king to bishop 1. And what happens now? The quiet move, queen to queen 7, is deadly. Now let's replace all those pieces. White queen back onto rook 6, white's knights back onto queen 5 and kb4, and black's king onto knight 1, black's pawns onto rook 2, knight 3, kb2 and king 2. Should be a black knight on kb3. And now we'll have to replace the black bishop. And Korchnoi chose to put it on qb3 rather than king 3. So black's move is bishop to queen's bishop 3 here. Well, how does white finish the game off here? It's not too easy. Karpov moved pawn to king 5, a second exquisite interference theme. Last time it was a rook, this time it's a pawn that interferes with the black queen. What happens though if black just takes the pawn on king 5? Black pawn takes pawn. Now white knight takes knight check, pawn takes knight, and now the unkindest cut of all, knight to rook 5, and black is helpless, because if pawn takes knight, rook to knight 1 check, and that's a mate. Now return those pieces. White's knight back onto kb4 and to queen 5. White's rook should be on king's rook 1, white's pawn should be on king 5, and a black knight should be on kb3, black pawns on knight 3, rook 2, bishop 2, king 2 and queen 3. So black hasn't got much choice. He's threatened with pawn takes knight, so he played bishop takes knight here. But that didn't help him. White pawn takes knight, threatens mate. Black pawn takes pawn. White queen takes pawn check. Black king to bishop 1. White queen to rook 8 check. Black king to king 2. I think Korchnoi resigned about this point because he was threatened with knight takes bishop check, queen takes knight, and then white rook to king 1 check, and white wins the rook. That was a brilliant finale, and it shows what trials that dragon players have to undergo sometimes. So I'll return to you to the hands of Eric Moskow.
The other game that we shall look at is the game Planich-Tarjan. This game went as follows. The same moves as in Karpov-Korchnoi up until the 16th move, at which point Tarjan played rook to king 1, which was analyzed before. If you now proceed from diagram number, if you now continue from diagram number 10, Tarjan's move, following Planich's knight to knight 3 instead of knight to queen 4, which Brown played, was rook to king bishop 5, exclamation point. Threatening rook to bishop 6 with an overwhelming position. Planich played rook to queen 3. Tarjan replied, rook from 1 to king 4. Planich played rook to rook 2. Tarjan played pawn to king rook 4. White, who is Planich, now played king to queen 2. Tarjan played king to rook 3 to help the advance of his kingside pawns. Consider this position for a few minutes and analyze black's possibilities. Planich now played knight to queen 5. Tarjan played rook to bishop 6. Planich played pawn to bishop 4, protecting his knight. Tarjan played king to king knight 4, advancing his king into the center. Planich played knight to king 2, question mark. Rook takes rook check, king takes rook, pawn to king rook 5. Planich now played king's knight from king 2 to bishop 3. Black replied pawn to king bishop 4, stopping knight to king 4 check. Knight to queen knight 5 was played, and pawn to king rook 6 was played. Knight to queen 4 was played. King to rook 5, rook to rook 1. The threat was king to knight 6 and knight 7 immediately with the pawn queening. Tarjan now played pawn to king knight 4. Spit when I talk. Knight to king bishop 6. King to knight 6. Knight takes bishop. Bit of a joke. Pawn takes knight. Pawn to queen knight 4. Gee, those pawns are moving quickly. Pawn to rook 7. Pawn to bishop 5. The race is on. King to knight 7. Planich was now smart enough to resign. He could have played rook takes pawn check and let black get 2 queens, but decided not to. Well, I hope you enjoyed this tape on the dragon. I know it was humorous for me to do, but in all seriousness, I've enjoyed it. I hope you learn a lot, and I hope you play it with great success. If you have any questions about the variation, you can write to me. Eric Moskow, 3 Andover Road, Great Neck, New York. Zip code 11023, United States of America. I would certainly be glad to answer any questions. If you have any other analysis that happens to refute anything in this tape, please send it to me, and I'll be glad to have it published somewhere. I hope you've enjoyed yourself, and good luck. Thank you.